laboratories as medical researcher in 1976 and eventually headed its clinical research department until the year 2000. In 2001, she served as a short-term consultant with the World Health Organization and also joined the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology of the UP College of Medicine as a professional lecturer until her appointment to the FDA. She was the president of the Philippine Society of Experimental and Clinical Pharmacology in 2004 to 2005, and also served as technical advisor for Medicine's Transparency Alliance from 2009 to 2010. Dr. Lazo is also a member of the International Society of Pharmacovigilance, and she was awarded the Outstanding Alumna Award for Leadership from her alma mater, the University of the East Ramon, and the Presidential Award from the Philippine College of Physicians for her efforts in promoting healthier food choices. Dr. Lazo is serving as a member of the National Adverse Event Following Immunization Committee, which is tasked with monitoring vaccine safety, especially with COVID-19 vaccines. And we are very grateful to have her with us today. Welcome, Dr. Suzette Lazo. Welcome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Dr.
for that introduction, Yanchi. I'm very glad to be with you. I was surprised, that this week we will have something like this, which is great because vaccines are very important to me. It's something that I passionately believe in and promote.
Okay.
And I want to share with you today what I know about vaccines, hoping to convince you that we need vaccines, especially in this pandemic.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Suzette. Before we proceed with your presentation, let me just introduce our other panelists. Dr. Kenneth Hartigan-Go is an adjunct faculty at the Asian Institute of Management and a non-resident research fellow of the Ateneo School of Government. He was Philippine Department of Health Undersecretary from 2015 to 2016, Director General of the Food and Drug Administration from 2012 to 2014, and Deputy Director of the Bureau of Food and Drugs from 1999 to 2001. Dr. Hartigan-Go was a founding executive director of the Zulig Foundation from 2001 to 2009. He was a member of the faculty of the UP College of Medicine, the Ateneo School of Medicine and Public Health, and the Asian Institute of Management. Doc Ken, as we fondly call him, holds Doctor of Medicine degrees from University of the Philippines College of Medicine and from Newcastle University in the UK. He is a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians in Edinburgh, a fellow of the American College of Physicians, honorary fellow of the Academy of Medicine, Singapore, and honorary fellow of the Singapore College of Physicians since 2017. He was president of the Philippine College of Physicians in 2017 to 2018. Doc Ken is currently the president of the International Society of Pharmacoeconomics and Outcome Research Philippine chapter and is a fellow of the Institute of Corporate Directors. Both our panelists are heavily involved in different organizations with a great impact on public health. That's why we are very grateful that they are with us today as part of their volunteer work with Wilton Park and Convince, otherwise known as the Vaccine Confidence Project. Thank you, Dr. Lazo and Dr. Hartigan-Go, for making time to join the Hello Doctor team and the rest of the Hello Health Group audience today. We now turn the floor over to you, Dr. Lazo.
Thank you. Yes. So if we can begin, can you share my slides, please, Sky? Thank you. So in finalizing this talk, I thought I would give the title that vaccines can end the pandemic. Next slide, please. By way of an introduction, you will probably, I am 100% sure, never in your lifetime see something like this beautiful child whose face is marred by scars. This is smallpox. I am old enough to have been probably among the few survivors who have received the smallpox vaccine. The virus is now eradicated, and it is because of the vaccine. After centuries and centuries of bringing suffering all over the world, it is gone. And it will never return because it's extinct. This virus was made extinct because it does not have a reservoir, an animal reservoir where it can hide. Unfortunately, the coronaviruses are not in that category because they do have animal reservoirs, which means it will be here for a long time. The other pictures show children with polio, again, very rare and almost extinct. Again, there's no reservoir for polio, but there's something about the oral vaccine that has been a cause of suffering and disease, and that's why now we're improving the oral vaccine and also reverting to the injectable format, because it was found that the oral vaccine, once it traverses through the gastrointestinal tract, mutates into an infective form. And that's why in recent times, there have been reports of sporadic cases, even in the Philippines, in Mindanao. Next slide, please. Here's just an illustration of child mortality from, there's a date down. Can you pull it up, please? Oh, I think there was a problem with the translation. Anyway, on the leftmost, that is 1960 to 2015. For someone, when I converted it to PDF, it became like this. No? So I will describe it. The blue line is the curve that belongs to the low income countries. The red line is the lower middle income country to which the Philippines belong. The green one is the average for the whole world. The yellow one is the upper middle income, and the purple one is the high income. And over time, from 1960 to 2015, you can see the decrease in child mortality. In the old days, it is ordinary to have at least one, maybe more children die in a family, especially Philippine families. But now it is a rare occurrence, and all this we owe to vaccines. Can I have the next slide, please? This is the timeline of the vaccine. So smallpox was actually discovered in the 18th century. And in the 19th century, they were already doing vaccines, manufacturing vaccines for the population. In fact, in the Philippine history, one of the unethical practices recorded was an American who did an experiment among Muntinlupa inmates on typhus. And he was found to have committed an unethical deed and was sent home. That was the worst punishment. And if you go back to history, I forgot his name. You can find this record. After the Second World War, what happened was there was improvement in practically everything in the economics of countries, so that science, had another head start after the Second World War, especially in the field of pharmaceuticals. That that period in the 1950s, shortly after penicillin was found to have anti-infective properties and eventually commercialized, was associated with discoveries of important antibacterial drugs, which opened the era of antibiotics and revolutionized the practice of medicine, furthering the progress of medical health and improvement in the quality of lives. At about this time, the polio vaccine was successfully developed by Jonas Salk of the US. It was the injectable form. And this again revolutionized the management and care and prevention of polio, so that eventually it decreased, and now it's totally gone. Certain countries like the US already are declared as polio free, and some other countries, but not the Philippines. Later on, you have other vaccines coming in, measles, mumps, and if we jump to the present now, in our century, you can see that there's been a lot, no? Pneumococcal conjugates, human papilloma virus, which already is touching the prevention of cancer, and other vaccines, including the COVID-19 vaccines. I must make mention that after the war, when there was a burgeoning of research, there were certain discoveries that really revolutionized our capability to develop vaccines. And this is the molecular biology, in the molecular biology area, with Watson and Crick's elucidation of the DNA that led to breakthroughs. And from that time on, there has just been an enormous development in this area, which is the reason why vaccines with the COVID pandemic came so fast, because the science has been laid in place. The past 20 years, they already learned how to make mRNA vaccines, for instance. And so we're lucky that we are in this level of scientific knowledge. If you compare this time against the 1918 epidemic, it's a long shot. So we have the vaccines. The trials were very fast. And the good news today, that is the newest I've learned, is that there's a paper that shows that the immunity may last for many months, even years. So that is good news that we certainly can use. So this slide shows you how successful the vaccines have been in reducing the number of diseases that have significant public health consequences. Unfortunately, this tremendous success also became a disadvantage for vaccines, in a way that it led to a higher standard being sought, so that people at this present time, for instance, are very sensitive to hearing about adverse events. When they hear about adverse events, they say, "Oh, I'm not going to take vaccines anymore because I don't want to be exposed to and have that adverse event." Sometimes the layman still does not probably value the importance of benefits outweighing risk. This concept is very important, especially in regulatory approvals of vaccines, because benefits, when they far outweigh the risk, even if you do have very rare adverse events, will justify the approval of a product that includes the approval of vaccines. So in this regard, again, I just want to emphasize the fact that vaccines really work, and we'll give you a short lowdown later on how they do it. Okay, next slide, please. So each year, vaccines prevent something like 2.5 million child deaths globally, and an additional 2 million child deaths, I think, would be prevented through immunization with currently available vaccines. One of the problems now, and the DOH is racing to augment the shortages in the other normal vaccinations that we give to children. See? This pandemic is causing so much impact on the healthcare of people, including the care of children, when they might not have been, on time for their usual immunizations. But I know they're trying to remedy it, because vaccines really enormously help in preventing diseases. The pneumococcal vaccines, for instance, given to adults and children, have incontrovertible evidence that they do really prevent morbidity based on the doctor consults and especially hospitalizations. Next slide, please. Okay. This is the model about, disease transmission and the contagiousness of disease. And this model applies to the pandemic. This virus that we're dealing with, the SARS-CoV-19 virus, is new. And being new, we don't have the immunity. So we cannot protect ourselves from getting sick, unlike other diseases where we have been exposed and our immune system already have the capability to resist the infection. And maximizing the public health benefits of vaccines require relatively high and sustained vaccine coverage, especially when we're dealing with a new virus like this one, because absolutely none of us in the beginning had any immunity. Oh, maybe some people, they say, if you have some coronavirus, you might have some neutralizing antibodies that may work against this new one, but that's probably very rare. So in this case, if you can distinguish, the blue ones denotes the not immunized but still healthy, which means you are predisposed to catching the disease. The yellow one is the immunized and healthy, and the red one is the not immunized, so you get sick. Okay? So what happens is, because you do not have any resistance, when you're exposed to the virus through contact with the people in red, then you are susceptible, and look at the people in the right side, they all got the disease. Next slide, please. In the second situation, some people in the population already got immunized. They are the yellow ones. Okay? And when somebody uh, carries the virus, exposing many people, still there's a lot of people getting sick because still no immunity. But when you have people who are immunized and they exist in a significantly large enough number, they will protect the other people around them. This is what we call herd immunity. So that in the third category, the lowermost picture here, you see that there's fewer people getting sick. And this is what we're after. When you vaccinate, you are giving an immunity that is different from the disease because it does not really make people sick. This is the magic of the vaccine. And this is the reason why it has succeeded very well. Because instead of you getting sick and maybe even dying from the disease, what happens is you develop the immunity with a minimum of side effects, usually. And for this reason, we need to have ourselves vaccinated. Getting a vaccine is an act of love and patriotism because by doing so, you make yourself immunized and so you protect yourself and also your loved ones and the people who are closest to you. The COVID vaccine is not like the tetanus vaccine. In the tetanus vaccine, even if you don't get it, there are no repercussions on the other people around you because it's only you who will bear the brunt of your wrong decision. You might get tetanus and die, but it will not affect other people. Not so with COVID. So important to have this vaccine because it's like the lives of other people depend on each of us. So we need to have this vaccine. Next slide, please. And how does the vaccine do this? It's actually a brilliant piece of work. Of course, you know, how they discovered the smallpox vaccine is a very long story. But this is the basis. What it does is that it takes a part of the pathogen and presents it to our body, specifically that part of our system, the immune system, that is able to defend us from infection. As you know, there's evolution and we're one of the products of evolution. Our present state is because our ancestors, our human ancestors, whatever they may be, Neanderthals or the Java man, they had the apparatus, the immune system that enabled them to survive all the insults that came from around them, that went into their bodies to make them sick, but they survived it. And that's the principle of selection. It's the fittest that that will survive. So here we are now with this immune system. And apparently this immune system is very powerful. We don't know all about it. The knowledge, the science is still developing. And this is one of my favorite entertainment, to listen to a podcast called TWIV, which goes in depth into the science because they're just discovering the effects on not only our innate immune system, but what they call the adaptive immune system, which is very powerful. It's made up of T cells and B cells with memory. with a memory such that after so many years, you get in contact again with an antigen, it remembers and mounts that defense. So this is the principle of vaccine. You prime the immune system, you tell it to recognize the enemy, and it does recognize the enemy. Only it takes some time for it to do that. That's why when you have the vaccine, it takes a couple of days before they say, you know, your immunity is working. And we also need a second dose, what we call the booster dose, a sort of a confirmation for the immune system na, hey, this is the one. Okay? Now, in the case of, for instance, I chose inactivated coronavirus because that's the one that I got, Sinovac. And there's good news again with Sinovac because there's new data that came in, no? that shows that in a small town in Brazil, it's working wonders already, and in a little community to reduce their infection, which means it's working. And there's also the debate that, you know, the more antigen you have, the better for you because of variants, which means if you present more antigen to our immune system, it has this a bigger picture of the enemy. Unlike certain vaccines, for instance, that contain only the spike proteins, so he'll only know the spike proteins. And if a variant manages to mutate the identity through variation in the protein sequence, then it might not recognize it anymore. This is the fear with some vaccines and variants when there's a loss in efficacy because of the mutation. Next slide, please. Okay, so how do vaccines work? I think you've probably heard it repeatedly. First, you know, it's the innate immune response, especially through the development of antibodies, neutralizing antibodies. And in this case of the SARS-CoV-2, you can see that you have the spikes here. Can you see the red spikes? And that's the one that binds with the receptor binding domain in the plasma membrane of the human cell, so that once it binds, it can enter the human cell. And then what happens is, because this is an RNA virus, it releases its RNA and then uses the mechanisms of our genome in the cytoplasm to manufacture itself and propagate itself. But if you are immune and you have antibodies, it blocks the spike, so it cannot bind with the ACE2 receptors on the surface of the human cell. So, and that's how it works. There are also other mechanisms, like what happens when the virus gets into the cell, it becomes shredded, and then it's put on the surface of the cell, and certain cells, like the antigen presenting cell, will present it to the bodies, the B cells, which is part of our immune system that makes antibodies. Okay? But the most important thing is that of the what they call the adaptive immune system. Okay. Next slide, please. I think I have it on the next slide. Here it is. Okay. So the adaptive immune system is the most powerful army. We call it's like an army, really, because they protect us against invaders. And on the right side, you can see this killer B cells attacking a tumor cell. And these killer B cells have enzymes inside them that can lyse whatever it is they're fighting against. Okay? And the B cells also have memory, so that once you know the enemy, it does not forget. When you encounter the same antigen years later, they will be able to identify and they will mount the same uh, reaction to protect us. And this is what you call the CD, the cell-mediated mechanisms. And right now, they do have the capability now to measure your T cell. This is a lab in UC San Diego that have been doing this measurement of your T cell activity, and they do it to look at the response to the vaccines. Next slide, please. And why do we need a second dose? So that's the reason why most of the vaccines we have now require at least 2 doses, is because this is already known a long time ago that when you have a primary response to an antigen and you give a booster dose, you get a much higher response. And it's like a confirmation in a way that the immune system is looking for. And it then is able to proliferate and develop more antibodies, develop more killer T cells and B cells. That's why it takes time. When you're doing a clinical trial, they wait at least 2 weeks after the second dose, 2 weeks to a month after the second dose, because you have to give time for your immune system to mount this. The cells have to develop and proliferate and all that. And that's why it takes time. So if you are getting a vaccine, if you're only, a few days after, just take it easy. Don't go out, especially the older people, because when we get old, it's been found that the immune system gets older also and weaker. And one of the reasons is because you have this collection of immune cells in your body that get used up. And when you're old, you have fewer of that. It's like the female sex. As you grow old, you no longer have the eggs. So the immune system works the same way. And the older we are, the more predisposed we are to infection, to cancer, because the immune system also goes into senescence. And that's why in this particular coronavirus problem, the older people are the one most susceptible. Next slide, please. Okay. So let's go back to vaccines. Sometimes things also go wrong with vaccines. Like this particular case, a practice that is wrong. Reusing the syringe, especially for reconstituting freeze-dried vaccines, it's going to introduce contamination. And there have been recorded cases, this is WHO data, that shows, patient receives vaccine, then develops fever, and some died. And it's because of an infection. And in the process of finding the answers here, you also need a lot of work, like culturing the vial that has been used. And in this case, you can see they were able to isolate Staph aureus, which is a very common bacteria, but can be a bad cause of an infection. Next, please. Here's another one that is considered as an error in the administration of a meningococcal vaccines. You know, people are busy and things sometimes get mixed up, especially when you deviate from certain prescribed rules and standards. Next slide, please. Okay. And here a muscle relaxant, atracurium, instead of the usual, saline, was used. And of course, it's a different kind of contamination. It's an error in the diluent that's very dangerous, and you're giving it to babies. Of course, here in this case, 15 children died. So this is part of the trauma that many people have suffered because of a mistake. And that's why, given the fact that vaccines are supposed to protect healthy recipients, but they die, this is a great tragedy and should be avoided at all costs. But you know how difficult it is to train new people every time. But awareness of the problem can also bring improvements in the practice and making people more careful about who to assign in very important roles, especially in the rollout of vaccines. But these things have been documented and do happen. Not in the Philippines, but in other countries. I think we have been very successful now in trying to teach the people involved in giving vaccines about storage, and also in the administration of vaccines, especially in avoiding contamination problems. Next slide, please. And also, vaccines do cause adverse events, but these adverse events are mild. Usually, these adverse events are expected because they have already been seen and observed in clinical trials. And serious adverse events are generally rare. One example, as you know, is the thrombosis with thrombocytopenia syndrome that's been recognized in the Astra vaccine at an incidence of something like 1 in every 250,000. So it's quite rare. We study usually in vaccines, normally 20,000 would be the average before in other vaccines. The 40,000 that they have used for studying COVID vaccines is already quite large. The only other vaccine that exceeds this number is the rotavirus, because something happened there. And so the vaccine had to be improved. And they used 70,000 in sample size in the population studied. And there's a reason for this, because you want to be able to detect adverse events usually there's the rule of 3. If you're using 40,000 and you divide it by 3, so that's about how much? maybe 15, 1 in 15,000. That makes it relatively rare. And like this thrombosis with thrombocytopenia, that was never detected in the trial because the trial only reached 40,000. See, that's the reason why once you're out there with your vaccine in the population, it's important to monitor and report adverse events, because there may be adverse events that can happen once you use a vaccine in the population. But these are rare. And if you consider it again, benefits outweigh the risks, especially when you have very rare side effects. And in many cases, even the TTS, this syndrome, thrombosis with thrombocytopenia that you see in some vaccines, there's already a therapeutic answer. No? When you know what you're dealing with, you can give certain things, in this case, the IVIG, as fast as possible. Next, please. And we do encounter hypersensitivity to vaccines. Just like, we have hypersensitivity even without vaccines to a lot of things. Food, pollen, even, contact dermatitis is a form of allergy. And in the case of vaccines, we do get different kinds of allergic reactions, like rashes. But we are most vigilant with anaphylaxis. This is the most dangerous type of allergy, and there is a way to, there are major criterias to be able to diagnose this and act fast, because there is already what do you call this, epinephrine, right, to give to people who have anaphylaxis. And we have encountered this. All were taken care of, all recovered. Some of them were doctors, and they were given appropriate treatment right away. So the problem was taken care of. Next slide, please. And according to the vaccine adverse event reporting, this is the VAERS system of the US. Usually you find it in the younger age group, the hypersensitivity to vaccines in general, not only to COVID. This one refers to H1N1. This is the flu vaccine. Next, please. Okay. So at this juncture of our time, there is a need for better vaccine safety, because the expectations is so much higher, especially when you give vaccines, which you're giving to very healthy people to prevent them from getting sick. There's a very low tolerance for adverse events now in our times, and this is being addressed. Next slide, please. Okay, for instance, the vaccines today are really much safer compared to the ones that we had before, in terms of purity, for instance, and the number of other particles and elements that you don't really need in the vaccine. There's also better quality, better manufacturing process. I mean, transport and storage. We have better formats. The manufacturing process is more controlled and really well regulated. Also, the diagnostics and therapeutics are very advanced. Imagine this COVID-19 vaccines are mainly new platforms, although they have been in the works for many years, but still they're new. They're the first one of their kind to be approved by regulatory. And also the standardization and harmonization. Next slide, please. This shows you the immunogenic proteins that's mentioned in the previous slides in the past compared to the present. Like smallpox before had 200 proteins compared to current day vaccines. Look at the number of protein components. This is important because this is the thing that will has the potential to evoke an allergic reaction. Okay? Look at the number. It has been reduced significantly in all kinds of vaccines. Before, the pertussis vaccine had up to 3,000, but currently it's 2 to 5, because that's one of the most difficult vaccines to deal with even now. The pertussis vaccine. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me introduce you to what we call an adverse event following immunization. This is any untoward medical occurrence which follows immunization, but which does not necessarily have a causal relationship with the dosage of the vaccine. This adverse event may be any unfavorable or unintended sign, abnormal laboratory finding, symptom, or disease. It could be an elevated sugar. That's an abnormal laboratory finding. It could be lowering of your platelet, or it could be something that gives you, makes you dizzy, or even have a stroke. So any of these we take seriously and should be reportable. Next slide, please. Okay. But we are more concerned with what we call the serious adverse event. So what is a serious adverse event? This is the adverse event that results in death, is life-threatening, and requires inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of existing hospitalization. It could also result in persistent or significant disability and incapacity, or even a congenital anomaly or a birth defect. And in our case, this is what we analyze: the serious adverse event, anything that falls into this category. Next, please. And which event should be reported? Anything. Actually, even the mild adverse events, you can report it. And as you know, when you get the vaccine, you are given this QR code or given other instructions on who to call. You can do online reporting. So any AFI that is of concern to parents or healthcare, report it. Serious AEFI, signals or events associated with a newly introduced vaccine. Signals are what we call certain events that may occur in clusters. For instance, if you're in an immunization campaign among the children and you're given something like measles, And let's just make a hypothetical case where there was a wrong diluent, and suddenly, all the kids started to become unconscious. That is what we call the signal. And so an AEFI that may have been caused by an error, we need to really look into everything, or an unexplained cause occurring within 30 days after vaccination, and events causing significant parental or community concern. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is what happens when we have an AEFI. So it gets detected, has to be notified or reported. Then we start the investigation. We really look deep into what happened. And in the case of patients, for instance, having a serious AEFI, like somebody who died 7 days after receiving the vaccine, we do an very intensive investigation, get all the hospital records, do interviews. And then we look at the records and try to see what happened, and get the answers to certain questions and find evidence on what really happened. When the situation falls, we might even need to do an autopsy. And in our committee, for instance, we have many specialists. We have a cardiologist, we have allergologists, and we also have a pathologist. We have infectious diseases people too. And we analyze the data, and we classify what was the cause. And doing causality assessment is quite difficult. It has also a long history. And it uses the science, all the science of medicine, the logic of inference, which was developed by Austin Bradford Hill, statistician from the UK, who also discovered, by the way, the cause of smoking. I mean, the cause of cancer, which was smoking. And we do feedback, which is important, so that we can try to limit the risk. For instance, you have seen what happened in the Astra reports initially, and it only took a matter of days before they came up with the conclusion that this clotting disorder, which happens in the venous system, happens to be a very rare autoimmune reaction. And they also have the therapeutic steps on how to help the patient once they manifest that AEFI. Next slide, please. So when do you report an AEFI? So it's as soon as possible, within 24 hours, ideally. Next slide, please. I think I'm nearing the finish. And I have already more or less described what we do in causality assessment. It's a systematic evaluation of the information that we obtain. And in a certain example, for instance, there was a child, not here, just to use it as an illustrative case, who was given a meningococcemia vaccine, a vaccine for meningococcemia, meningococcal vaccine. And soon after the vaccination, the child started to become, restless, and he was crying, and eventually the sensorium became obtunded, and it was something with the brain, and he just received a vaccine that's also for the brain. Anyway, you would think that this was an AEFI, but on studying the cerebrospinal fluid specimen and culturing it, they found another virus. So it's in this case, coincidental problem. This one was a herpes infection of the central nervous system that had very bad timing. It happened immediately after vaccination. And when we speak of coincidence, an example which is easy to describe and probably understand is if you get a vaccine and then when you were crossing the street, you get run over by a car. You know, that's an adverse event following immunization. But as you can see, it was just coincidence, the vaccine. It was not because of the vaccine, no? It was something else. And we are seeing this. Sometimes people, you know, uh, die days or weeks after the vaccine. And on reviewing the records, they do have comorbidities. In fact, an underlying problem with the cardiovascular system that's been building up for years. It so happened that it just did its worst attack, like an MI following the days or weeks after the vaccination. And in this case, that is ruled as a coincidental event. Next slide, please. So what's the function of causality assessment? Of course, we want to identify vaccine-related problems or errors and also exclude coincidental events. Sometimes it's very hard for people to separate everything. Any bad thing that happens just because somebody had a vaccine, the bias is there already and it's automatically blamed on the vaccine, which is bad. Not only unfair, but bad because it might discourage the use of vaccines. And where would we be, especially now in this pandemic, when we do need the vaccine very badly? That's the only way we can stop the pandemic. It's not going to be through herd immunity, because what happened with the Swedish experiment is that ultimately they had to admit that they were wrong. You kill people unnecessarily with natural infection because COVID is a multi-organ disease, and it's really, the mortality increases as the age also increases. But there's a better way, vaccines. And we do have to control this pandemic soon if we need to get our economy to recover. And also, of course, finally, what we're seeing after regulatory approval and the vaccine rollout is a sort of a validation of the pre-licensure safety data in the clinical trials. It's a sort of post-marketing, but a more intense kind of surveillance. Next slide, please.
Doctor, this is the last slide.
Okay, so
Yeah.
so I think I will end here. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay. Thank you very much for that, Doc Suzette. Well, one line that stood out to the Hello Doctor team was when you said that getting vaccinated is an act of love and an act of
It is.
patriotism. And to me, what stood out was the BTS part, the B cells, T cells, superheroes that we have in our system. Okay.
Right.
So now we turn the floor over to Dr. Kenneth Hartigan-Go for his reaction and additional information that he may share with us.
Thank you very much, Kai. Thank you, Suzette, for your fantastic lecture.
Thank you.
Dr.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Suzette took us through a very fundamental and basic understanding of vaccination, and the nuances of what they do in terms of causality assessment. And I thought that was very important because as doctors, we need to explain this very carefully to our patients to improve vaccine literacy and to address that fear. What's very important that I took notice of that is that we you went through a process where you took the AFI seriously, notwithstanding the fact that many of them are really so rare, and the common reactions that we see are so minor. But you went through it because we did not dismiss it. All the more you took particular notice of it, so that we are able to then prepare a good risk communication with our patients, because also we have a duty to inform. But I'd like to take the lessons that we have today in order to for our audience to understand all of these things we're trying to share with you is really a practice of health leadership. We have three agenda here. The first one is to fight misinformation and to fight disinformation. And secondly, if we see some deficiencies in terms of services given by government or outside services, we have duty also to try to correct that deficiency. After all, we're dealing with a pandemic that is so novel, so new. In our lifetime, we've not met situations like this before. So everybody's on a learning curve. But lastly, as a leader in our audience, doctors and lay community leaders alike, our duty is also to give hope so that we can collaborate together and deal with this problem at hand. Now, the one of the impacts of vaccines I like to share with you. I mean, both Dr. Lasso and myself, we were health regulators at the Food and Drugs, so we understand it from a regulatory bureaucratic perspective, but we don't look at issues like this merely from a point of view of a health product. Because the quality of a vaccine, for a regulator, the quality of vaccines that we give license to, and in this case, an emergency use authorization, which is different from a marketing authorization that anybody can buy it and use it and distribute it. Has to be something restricted by the government and selected parties in order to administer for a public health emergency. Now, and therefore, we look at it very carefully. So there are guidelines that we follow. No? And what are they? How do you quality assure these vaccines? Well, uh, vaccines should not be looked at merely as a product, although it's very, very heavily regulated. In what way? Well, the manufacturing plant has to be inspected, and we have to have proof that they comply with good manufacturing practice for vaccine production, and they practice good storage practice, and they adhere to good distribution practice. Why is that? Well, vaccines are very sensitive technology that can change and be destroyed because of temperatures, poor temperature stability. Some of them have to be kept at a very frozen temperature during logistics, transport, and storage. What else is important? Dr. Suzette Lasso mentioned in passing the need for clinical and preclinical data because testing is important. And here is the company able to adhere to protocols of good laboratory practice and good clinical practice because there's a host of clinical trials that has to be undertaken here. Now, people wonder, are we taking shortcuts? Well, no, because the exact same criteria bench milestone where a vaccine has to be assessed, evaluated, regulated, demands that it goes through the same process, except that the timelines have shifted. Some of them are done in a very parallel way, so that in the context of this emergency, this is allowed. Now, not only that, and Dr. Lasso mentioned that safety surveillance of vaccine is important, and that's really part of after the authorization for emergency use has been given. That's part of the quality assurance of the vaccine after the authorization is given, and that demands that countries, their functional national regulatory authority or their FDAs, for instance, have to practice risk management. One of those things that are being seen right now is their challenge in dealing with fake news. So again, what is the lesson here? Quality is no longer a product issue, but a systems issue. Because now we looked at compliance to those process, product testing, and then regulatory review. However, I'd like to share with you what I thought might be important lessons on constraint. In this pandemic, there is a demand for companies to have increasing capacity to manufacture vaccine amidst rising cases of COVID around the world. And why is this important? Because this will lead to global vaccine shortage if the plants are not able to undertake this well. There are talks about passing the technology through licensing to manufacturers outside of the original manufacturers in other countries. And this is sort of a sharing of technology, compulsory licensing, if you want to call it, but there has been some barriers because some countries refuse to share that technology to help other countries put up these vaccines. Now, putting up a vaccine plant in another country to develop it according to the formulation is not going to be easy because the regulators in that country will have to be under a maturity level 3 and 4. That they have to have, for instance, a national control laboratory to do lab testing and batch testing in order to ascertain that the vaccines are of good quality. Now, again, increasing assurance for safety, Dr. Suzette Lazo tackled that because of increased expectation and low tolerance for a vaccine given to normal people. The normal, I mean, without any other illnesses, but there is a chance that they might get adverse effects. The vaccine manufacturing is indeed very complex, and I will share some of this discussion when we discuss vaccine myth. Not only the production is needed, but also cost containment. So therefore, uh, I now bring a few things that I thought the audience should know about. It's on the issue of ethics and dilemma. Number one, the use of novel vaccine and its uncertainty is actually telling us to be more careful because you now have to weigh benefit and risk in the same equation. In many countries, knowing how serious COVID is and its spread and the chance of fatality and the lack of resources in hospital systems means that the principle of utility, comparing benefit and risk, is very important. Secondly, we have to understand the issue of herd immunity. There are others who are still anti-vaxxers who do not want to get their vaccine, although they don't realize it. They are actually being protected by those around them who have been vaccinated. And this is was, as Dr. Lasso has explained, the principle of herd immunity. And one of the other things I want to share with you is a nagging issue of vaccine nationalism. Now, I told you earlier that there is a global vaccine shortage. No? Many of the more advanced countries have cornered the vaccines, and those that are producing vaccines are also not wanting to share the vaccine to other countries. I mean, if not people are not protected with the vaccine, we are not protected because eventually people are going to travel, they're going to get affected. So this is one shall we say, unfortunate observation that we have that keeping vaccines for the use of your own country because of your own need and neglecting what other countries need, for instance, is a form of vaccine nationalism that we need to address. But the second one, which I think people haven't realized yet, although the World Economic Forum has discussed this, is the imposing of travel restriction. So, for instance, one country does not want travelers to enter their country simply because they do not recognize the vaccine that is used by the country where the travelers come from. So now it is necessary now for countries' authorities around the world to discuss how are they going to recognize this vaccine through an official vaccine passport. And I can understand this because these vaccines were not authorized for emergency use in their own country. Why would they allow somebody from another country whose vaccine are used but are not recognized by them? So that the mutual recognition is an important paradigm in regulatory work, and that I think will be the subject of a very important discussion coming soon. So these are the ethical and dilemma concerns that I have that I brought out for consideration. What else do I want to share with you? Oh, somebody sent me well, it was a humor, but it is to address the issues of anti-vaxxers. And this was an analogy that they gave. No? They said that the food can cause choking and even deaths, especially in children. And the choking statistics around the world and in certain major countries, a choking death occurs every 2 hours. A leading cause of death in person over age 65 is choking. People have become disabled because of choking hazards, and one child dies from choking every 5 days. So, given that, they came to a conclusion that feeding is dangerous, and therefore they tell everybody else, do your own research and decide what is best for your kids. If you choose to give your children food, then that is your problem, because as parents, they are now telling them, don't listen to government. They have no right to force the parents to give children food that they need. Although they say food is going to help starvation and give nourishment, they don't believe it. This is how anti-vaxxers are operating, and it's very dangerous because they're playing with the minds of people in a science that is complicated, and people wouldn't believe them, and that's really a very dangerous thing. Now, I'd like to discuss a few vaccine myths. This one we've heard, no? Vaccines have been rushed and therefore not safe. As explained by many international organizations, the pharma industry, and government authorities, the vaccines follow the same pathway. They have benchmark that they have to go through. They cannot jump and shortcut it, although they are doing things in parallel and submitting data in a rolling fashion. So it is no truth that the vaccine are being rushed and therefore not safe.
Right.
Some of the comments I've heard is that vaccine can alter your DNA. That's not true. Even those mRNA vaccines, it doesn't change your DNA. So, and then you're going to get COVID virus into your body because of the vaccine. That's not true. Some of the COVID vaccines carry the parts of the virus, and some are attenuated and made not potent, so you don't have the active disease. Although some people have said that we don't like the vaccine because it contains egg protein, and I'm allergic to eggs. That's not true. There are no egg proteins into the vaccine. And some are complaining that, oh, I'm afraid because I've heard that vaccine contains products that will make me infertile, like hormones. Those were rumors that we have heard for many, many years ago with tetanus vaccine in parts of Africa, in the Philippines. But there's nothing in the vaccine that contains products that will make you infertile. Do the vaccine contain excipients? Yes. These excipients are necessary for like adjuvants. They contain stabilizers, preservatives, and those things are important part of the vaccine formulation, which makes the vaccine effective. But it doesn't cause harm. Now, in the past, you must have heard of some excipients like aluminum can cause because they're metals, and some contains heavy metal like thiomersol. These are products that can cause autism. Again, this the data has proven that this is not true, and those who have perpetrated this false news have probably harmed more people, including the disease for which a vaccine could have protected them. No? So share some. I'd like to stop here for a while and maybe entertain some questions if ever there are any from our audience. But remember, we have a duty of care by understanding vaccine and translating this to communication to help our patients. But one of the concerns that we have, by the way, say from the Philippines, is that um, in promoting vaccine literacy, we found out that there are people who are still afraid of getting vaccines for COVID. No? A Pulse Asia survey done in the Philippines the months of February and March of this year showed that 6 out of 10 Filipinos still don't want to get vaccinated against
Yeah.
COVID-19. And when we asked them why, these were the figures, where 84% of the respondents say we're not sure of its safety. Again, it's really the lack of information that gets to them to allay their fears. The other data that we have is the vaccine might not be effective. Yes, there are some vaccine failure that might happen, but by and large, we are not looking at the clinical efficacy per se based on the study, but we're looking at real world data that they will protect you from hospitalization and getting into complication of COVID. And other countries have already proven this, and I don't think that people should be afraid that these vaccines are not effective. The vaccine is not needed to combat COVID-19. There are 6% of this population believing in this. No? Some of them even believe that the COVID-19 virus is a fabrication and not even true. So this is a difficult. I mean, as a clinician, we have been helping patients. Some of them during the height of COVID scare and the rising cases that we see, they are all rushing to hospitals, and it's not easy to get them into a hospital because the hospitals were all saturated in terms of many people were waiting in the intensive care emergency room outside in tents on the parking lot trying to get in. So there's a long waiting queue, sometimes to as many as over 50 in the waiting list just to get into the hospital. Oh, so that raises another dilemma, no? Because some of the patients are begging and their family members are begging because they're so afraid of getting COVID and the complications of it. They've heard how people have died because the media also show this kind of figures in the public that they're actually begging to jump the queue to get into the hospital setup. And it's very difficult because for the healthcare professionals in particular, they have to make a decision. The decision can be very traumatic after the event. Who do I prioritize? You have two patients with equal chances of survival. One is rich, one is poor. Who do I prioritize? One has a poorer prognosis, the other has a better prognosis. Who do I give the ventilator to? Remember, in our segment of the world, we are working in a health system where there are scarce resources. And when they are demanding all this kind of treatment, the hospital systems are flooded, no? And they are overwhelmed. And the frontliners are very, very tired, no? Dealing with this. So those are the ethical dilemmas. I thought our audience should understand the difficulty of the healthcare professionals in deciding in this kind of problems. Okay, perhaps I have some data as well that people are afraid to go to a vaccination center. And when we got down to the bottom of it, we explained to them, we showed them pictures of how the vaccination sites look like. People are practicing physical distancing. There are disinfection going on every time patients change their seats when they meet the staffers who are going to deal with them in the vaccination. So we explained to them that, well, what happens is that you sign up with your local government unit. It could be your barangay, city hall. They have a duty of creating a registration system, and then they prioritize those who are health frontliners, people who are elderly, and those with comorbidity. But for other countries, they prioritize younger economic frontliners. That's okay. It depends on different countries and their priority because they probably analyze that those who are most likely to get sick will have financial risks, no? And as well as health risks of dying. So as you go into this vaccination site, there's registration, there's counseling, and triage to make sure that you fit into the criteria and that you don't have any, shall we say, contraindication to get vaccination, which we actually find very little. No? very few. Then you undergo screening where a doctor asks you questions about allergies, anaphylaxis, hypersensitivity in the past, just as a precaution before they administer the vaccine. And then the vaccination is given, they give you a vaccination card, and then you are monitored for a period of 30 minutes to 1 hour after that vaccination to make sure that you don't have any reaction coming from that vaccine. And by and large, our work in the vaccination centers are very smooth. There's no problem that we see, except that we do see cases of hypertension, partly because of anxiety reaction. Some of them are really hypertensive, although they are asymptomatic and on treatment, doesn't mean that they are contraindicated from receiving that vaccine. So we see these cases a lot, and people do report that they have injection site pain, which is expected. Not everybody gets it, but they do recover within 24 to 48 hours. So again, we'd like to say the endpoints for the COVID-19 vaccine, one of which is to prevent infection, prevent the disease, prevent contamination and transmission, and also the chance of being admitted to the hospital and getting into an intensive care unit and decrease therefore the mortality. So I'd like to stop here and then go back to Kai, our moderator, and see if we have any questions from the audience that we could help answer. Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
Doctor. Thank you very much. We actually have a question from our colleague in Cambodia, from Chet. His question is, why some countries like Chinese vaccines, like Sinovac and Sinopharm, and Sputnik of Russia, uh, trade or donate to some other countries without WHO approval? There are rumors that those vaccines are only 50% to 70% in terms of efficacy.
Yes.
Is it safe to get these vaccines?
All right. I'd like to. This question has a lot of components. No, are the vaccines effective, given the clinical efficacy from the trial? Okay, there is a difference between clinical efficacy and real world effect, public health effectiveness. In clinical efficacy, you are looking at data coming from trials, and the subject population can be different. They could be tested on health frontliners, they could be tested on community population, so they could be tested in a certain groups with different age. So it is not fair to compare the clinical efficacy based on the data coming from clinical trials per se or alone without looking at the context. Because the endpoint that we're looking at is how well the vaccines give you some antibodies to protect you so that you don't get the disease. The efficacy doesn't is not clinical efficacy is only a surrogate marker from your clinical study. It's the real world effectiveness we're looking at. Can they prevent you from getting the disease and transmitting it and complications? Now, it these vaccines, though give the WHO doesn't dictate. It's not a regulatory agency. It doesn't dictate that you should use certain vaccine, although they have given some parameters and guidelines to national regulatory authority on how to assess those vaccines. It is up to the country's regulatory body to do their due diligence in asking for what the data from the manufacturers in order to look at it from a point of view. Do they follow, for instance, good manufacturing practice? Where are the preclinical data, clinical data from phase one and phase two trial? Do they follow manufacturing process carefully? Is there a control lab that does the batch and lab testing? Do they follow good storage practice? Uh, what about the posology, the sterility of the product? Those are the things that the regulatory agency look for. The the WHO does their emergency use listing in order to help countries whose regulatory agency are unable to do their own EUA or emergency use authorization. The EUL that they do is helping these countries to so that they can choose to adopt it if they wanted to. And many countries that we know are using the China vaccine from China and and from Russia. And so far, we have had good reviews about their effectiveness and safety profile as well. The other thing the WHO does in terms of putting them in the EUL is also to consider for the future whether they can join the COVAX facility. COVAX facility is a tripartite arrangement with CEPI, Gavi, and with the WHO in terms of helping developing countries gain some of the first set of vaccine in order to prioritize this for their people in need, because their interest there is to address health inequity. So that's one of the reasons why they have set up the EUL for WHO as a guidance for other countries, and countries can choose to adopt it or have their own EUA approval using the same kind of regulatory guidelines set forth in different countries. And I can tell you that when I reviewed some of the guidelines, they are very, very rigid. So rigid that does take time before the EUA can be released. So I believe that the regulatory agency do take this very seriously. Some regulatory agencies benchmark their decision with other countries that have more stringent way of doing things. No? So they have reference countries as well. Those regulatory agencies that are WHO listed authority with maturity level 4, which is the highest stringent. Yeah, I hope that helps answer this question from Cambodia.
Yes,
Thank you,
Doctor.
Dr.
Thank you.
Ken. Yes. So we have another question, Doc, from our colleague here in the Philippines, Dexter. Particularly for the COVID-19 vaccine, what if a patient accidentally got a different vaccine brand for his or her second dose?
This is a
Would
hypothetical
that be
question.
safe po?
This is a hypothetical question
Yes, yes.
because I don't think you will get an accident if you follow the protocol, that you show up on your vaccine day, that you know what vaccines that you're taking. And although there's a controversial issue in our country, which we can discuss that later on, will something like that happen? I don't know. I don't have the data, but there are studies in other countries looking at cross use of vaccine. So I guess if you are strict about it, let's just wait for the data. Uh, Perhaps nothing is going to happen because these vaccines work similarly in terms of stimulating your immune system. The mechanisms might be different, but the outcomes are the same.
Thank you,
I
Doc.
don't. Do you want to take a shot at it? That question.
I think you're right. No, there's probably no safety issue, but it could be an efficacy. You have to justify the jump to another vaccine. Like, well, first of all, we don't know yet how long the immunization from the vaccines will last, because it's a moving target. But there's a good chance that it may be like the flu vaccine, when after a year we will need another, maybe a booster, or maybe even another vaccine. All this, I think, is in a state of flux right now, because there are some studies that's looking at uh, mixing and matching vaccines. What happens if you boost with another brand? But as
Yeah.
of now, we cannot say anything because there's no data yet.
There's
It's
no
all
data.
ongoing.
Although I want to share something with you, there are patients who are asking us that, oh, we have no choice, but we're going to receive this brand X of a vaccine, but we don't really trust it, but it's there, it's given. So they told us, whatever vaccine is available, go ahead and get it. But we are going to get another vaccine we like from the Western country 6 months later. Yeah, and then they asked me, is it okay? Is it safe? I said, I really don't know. Probably it's okay. You're not going to get any hyperimmune stimulation.
Right.
However, there's an ethical issue here. You might be depriving another person access to that vaccine because you're only thinking about yourself. No? You're not thinking about other people, and we have to vaccinate a lot of people, millions, in order to hit 70% of the population. to achieve herd immunity. So I think people, this is a situation that we have to think about solidarity, protecting other people as well as yourself, but not think about yours just for yourself. No? And I think that's really because of lack of scientific understanding. Rain has an interesting question here. Do you think that blood clotting has something to do with the fact that both Astra and Janssen vaccines are viral vector vaccine? Uh, well, I think it's been, well, first, let's put it in context. The clotting um, that happens with these vaccines are very, very small. In my computation, I don't know, I think Suzette gave a different number as well. My number that I got was 0.004%. It's very low that the chance of getting a blood clotting. But now they have identified that this blood clotting is due to antibodies that are attacking your platelets or thrombocytes so that you get a low platelet count, but you are getting clotting. So this is a syndrome that has surfaced, but it's so rare. The chance of getting a blood clot with COVID-19 is to the tune of 16.9%. So if you get COVID, and it's likely that people, as they open up and go around, they will get COVID, but the chance of getting it so much higher. You get blood clotting with oral contraceptives, with smoking, with you name it. No, there are other situations that you can get blood clotting, and but I think this question is a very theoretical one. Is it due to the viral vector as the cause? I'm sorry, I don't know how to answer that question.
The jury is still in session with that
Mm.
with that question.
Mm-mm.
By the way, Ken, I wanted to add to your mention of the fear of sterility associated with the vaccine. You know how it came up?
No.
Because we use the word, medicine has a funny way of using vocabulary. We talk about insults in a different way. And we use the term sterilizing immunity.
Ah, okay,
That's how
okay.
we,
All right. But that means it's for the virus. It's not for the
right,
human body. It's a
not
yeah,
the,
sterilizing the
but
virus. Oh
it's
dear, you're right. This is one
sterilization.
lesson for risk communication. I found out that even authorities and people who are learned scientists, and they may be very good, but the way they communicate, I think all of us need to have a crash course on how to communicate properly. Because sometimes we use things, we take it for granted. No?
And they're trying to change now the term herd immunity because people don't like to be
Yeah.
called the herd. Community immunity.
I've heard of the word neutralizing immune
Yeah.
antibodies.
That's an antibody, neutralizing antibody, but
Yeah.
this one is sterilizing immunity.
Uh-huh.
And also, I think doctors' population control was a term that was also used earlier.
Yeah.
That's a story idea. That's a story idea we need to put together so that we can have a clear definition
And
of
properly
terms.
communicate it to our
Sure, at the
readers.
proper context, yes. So, Doc Suzette, Doc Ken, we have a question from Ploy of Thailand. Can the
Mhm.
vaccine stimulate underlying diseases to show up? For example, if I have underlying hypertension, will the vaccine make my blood pressure spike?
Um, Thank you very much for your question from Thailand. In our vaccination site, we have I go on duty in this vaccination site, and we do see people getting hypertension uh, before the vaccination, and more so after the vaccination. And this could just be related to anxiety, hypertension. Some of them have very poor medicine compliance, but we don't believe that the vaccine per se itself is going to stimulate hypertension. Maybe the pain, the anxiety, the heat of the environment contributes to it, but not that we know of that the vaccine. Maybe we have to wait for more data coming in around the world. Um, One of the things I think people also misconstrue is that when you give a vaccine or a drug, and then immediately something happens afterwards, they think it's temporally it's a causation by temporal association. But I think Dr. Suzette has explained that is not causation. That is maybe coincidental, and I think we have to separate that. And secondly, when I was doing some research, I found out that some countries do not have a good baseline data of their medical conditions before the pandemic.
Mm.
You see, once you start intervening and people says, well, nothing changed, you gave us this vaccine and now I'm feeling this bad, they start saying that it's due to the vaccine. Well, scientifically what we do is to look for signals, which I think Dr. Lasso mentioned earlier. What is the attributable risk of an intervention or vaccine that led to what you're feeling? And for us to do that, we need to have background rates of, say, hypertension without the vaccine to compare with. And only if you have more clusters and or higher clusters of the same situation beyond the background incidence of that condition, then we start looking at there is an attributable risk. If not, the chances are it's probably a background incidence, not related to any intervention. Okay.
For our next question, sorry, just to correct, we meant population protection, not population control. Was a newer term that's being used. Anyway, so for our next question from Tony, if I have the choice of more than one COVID vaccine, which should I take?
Of, of any, you can take any of the vaccines uh, based on what we know with our consultation to our local expert. There it's as I say, the outcomes are the same. They build immunity, and that's what we're looking for.
Doctors,
Agree.
but it reflects to the quality of the vaccines, she mean.
So sorry, your question is how about the quality of the vaccine, right?
There are some few vaccine in the market that are offered by the government, and then there are Sinovac, Astra, and Sinopharm for those
Hmm.
three.
Hmm.
So which one among them, if you have choice, which one is better than the others?
Well, I'm not going to tell anybody which one is better than the other one. Obviously, there are some differences, but overall, the dictum here is that any of the vaccines, as far as we know as of the moment, has effectiveness, public health effectiveness.
But
So
it affect to the percentage of the outcome of the quality of those vaccine, which claimed by WHO or by the institution of the manufacturer themselves. Is it?
I wouldn't believe the manufacturers themselves because they have probably vested interests. But I think you need to rely on third-party assessor, maybe WHO and others. But I've not heard of any information coming from an international health organization promoting one brand over the other ones.
Yes, yes, that's correct.
WHO having not given an EUL to other products doesn't mean that they are poorer quality. It's just that they haven't finished their evaluation. I mean, WHO recently gave Sinopharm vaccine the EUL listing. Well,
And also Sinovac. It
they
was
already
given. Yeah, it is.
Yes, yes.
okay.
It
Then
already
my information is quite delayed, no. So
quick, I think.
yeah.
I think we have another follow-up question to that. Any impact, side effect, or harm that the quality of the vaccine once the second dose is late? Let's say days or up to 1 week more from the scheduled second dose, like space, the interval between the doses. Would that have an effect on its effectivity?
Okay, I'd like to try to answer that. When we check with our local vaccine and infectious expert, they say don't worry. Sometimes vaccine, the interval of vaccine, second dose vaccine were based on clinical trial data. So there are ones that are 4 weeks, there are ones that are 12 weeks interval of giving. But they said that even if they were delayed by a month, it doesn't really matter. And data now, for instance, in with AstraZeneca saying that if you delay it longer, it looks like the outcome seems to be better. But you remember that when we talked about this COVID vaccine, there are long-term data that we still don't have, and decisions have been made based on available clinical trial, which may change over time, and we're learning new things as these things are evolving. So delaying it with the AstraZeneca, for instance, was claimed to be it's still okay. In fact, it gives you a little bit more protection if you delay it, based on some of the graph that they have shown us. So I
May,
wouldn't worry that much. Yeah.
may I add to that? Actually, as people get vaccinated, they get the data and analyze, and that's what happened with AstraZeneca. So they found out from the original 4-week interval, then they lengthened the interval to 8 to 12 weeks because there is a better boost, and this is consistent with what I was telling you about the immune system. It takes time to proliferate with the cells and all that. Lately they're finding the same thing with the Pfizer vaccine, that if they prolong the interval there is a better response. So I think they're doing it now, try to prolong it by another month, I think.
Yeah. Sokha from Cambodia has a very interesting question, a very clinical question actually.
Yeah,
If we
thank
have the
you.
first dose of vaccine, but unfortunately got infected with COVID-19, which can happen, no? We have seen a few cases of those who were vaccinated, and then within a short span of time, they had COVID. We believe that this is coincidental, that while they were moving around, they got infected, but they were asymptomatic, but they got vaccinated anyway. So, and these things do happen. And yesterday I saw one like that. No? And should we, once they have recovered from COVID 19, will you have to take another 2 doses of vaccine again? The answer is no. Just follow the protocol and get the next shot as scheduled, because the first shot that you got will confer you some level of immunity after 2 weeks, but it's not
Mhm.
optimal yet. So you just have to get another shot. No? So, yeah, 2 days ago, we got word that CDC says that once you there are also changes now that you in their recommendation here in our country is if you get a vaccine like flu vaccine and then you have to get a COVID vaccine, you need to space it 2 weeks apart. But though our local rules have not changed yet, there are apparently some international rules from CDC that says that there's no matter, you can just go give it at the same time. There's no interval necessary. But we await our local authorities, regulators to tell us the protocol. But what we're saying that this information are evolving, they change. So we need to pay attention to some of this evolution of information.
May I add to that? It's funny because one of the papers that I'm just indexing is uh, an article from MedPage today. It says CDC sheds light on breakthrough COVID infections. And guess what? Breakthrough infections are rare, but the variants likely played a key role, researchers are saying. So here's the variants, I think, getting
Yeah.
into the act.
So that means the vaccines that we're getting may not 100% give us protection because of the variants, is what you're saying. Oh,
Well, no, this is with the US data. But
oh,
I'm I'm quite surprised with the Sinovac.
mm-mm.
There is an article in Brazil about a community that is quite enclosed. so that they're able to study the effects of Sinovac vaccine. And they are in Brazil, so it includes the Brazilian variant for sure. And it is very impressive, the drop in the cases. I picked this up from the post of Edsel and looked at it. So it's good news for the Sinovac. This is real world evidence of a community. And that study is registered in clinicaltrials.gov. It's
Okay.
called the Proyecto something. Cerezo, I think. It's in Brazil. It's a community in Brazil.
Yeah.
Okay.
When we talk about vaccines, oftentimes we focus so much on the science of it, and
Right.
but there are other things that we rarely talk about. Is that there is a social benefit to the vaccines, because now people can interact with each other because of the protection, not just getting them out of the diseases, but there are also economic benefits and impact of the vaccine, like cost savings, productivity, ability to go to work, open business. So if we look at it from a holistic level, when we talk about vaccine, beyond the science, there are benefits in economics and social as well. And that I hope would be my message to our audience.
Thank you po, Doc Ken. Just rounding down to our last few questions. Drew of the Philippines asked if there's a chance that the COVID-19 vaccine will become an oral drug.
Ah, I don't know about that, Suzette. I
I
think
know
vaccines,
there's a nasal spray
nasal,
vaccine
yeah.
that
Oh,
works, but
yeah.
I
I
don't
think I
know
think
about oral drug. It
I
might not work. You know why? It will get destroyed in the stomach.
yeah,
It's so
yeah,
acidic.
yeah.
Okay. Um, do the flu and pneumonia vaccines help provide protection against COVID?
Not
No.
directly. Not no. Well, no, it doesn't. But not directly as well, because the doctors have recommended that they get your annual flu shots and your pneumococcal shots, because they want to lessen the incidence of compromising your lungs and your infection,
Right.
to to minimize that. No, but it doesn't actually protect you from this COVID that we have right now.
Okay. Actually, Doc Ken, Doc Suzette, we have about a kilometer long list of questions from our guests and the staff. We'll find a way to get in touch so that we can get those questions
Okay.
answered, and then we'll create content out of that. So we can wrap our Facebook Live now with your final word, please, for our audience.
Go ahead,
Suzette, you want to
Ken.
go first?
So I think, as Kai said, maybe I should reiterate my message. It's so important for us to get vaccinated because it's the best way, and probably it may even be the only way to stop this pandemic. And when you take a vaccine, you're not doing it only for yourself, but for your loved ones, and also for the people closest to you and for the rest of the country. And that's one way we have to get our economy restarted and recovering. Otherwise, we're in for very, very hard times ahead.
Thank you, Suzette. And my final message is, there's so much news out there that we like to tell everybody in society to practice critical thinking. We have a duty of care for ourselves and for a moral duty as well, no? To understand the information that we're receiving. Some of them are false, misinformation, disinformation, and I think don't fall victims to this information that you get from social media. It's too good to be true, don't believe it. If it's all negative, also don't believe it. Me- they, people have a sense of uh, the propriety of listening to conspiratorial news and sensational news and headlines is so prevalent that we have lacked the skills to ask skeptical and critical questions. And I think our duty is to care for our society. And again, reiterate what Dr. Lasso says. Um, we have a moral duty to get vaccinated and protect other people.
Okay. Thank you very much, Doc Ken and Doc Suzette. Well, the Hello Health Group is here because we have the platform to spread the message and the correct information. So thank you for answering our questions. We have more questions that we will send to you directly. And to everyone who's tuned in with us for the almost 2 hours, thank you very much for spending your time and energy with us. In behalf of the Hello Doctor team in the Philippines and our panelists, Dr. Suzette Lazo, Dr. Kenneth Hartigan-Go, and of course, we want to acknowledge Dr. Lulu Bravo, the Dean of Vaccination in the Philippines, one of our pillars who is here as an audience. She's listening to the lecture of our two panelists. Thank you very much, Doc Lulu. So on behalf of the team, thank you, and we'll see you in our next FB Live here on Hello Doctor.
Thank you, doctor.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much.